guys, welcome to another session of supplement tutorials. Today I'll be taking you through introduction to chemical pathology, and we'll be going through the various topics or disciplines under chemical pathology. Okay, so basically chemical pathology is the systematic study of chemical processes associated with health and diseases and the measurements of the constituents in the body or tissue for diagnosis purposes. So chempath, we can get chem and then path. So just analyzing chemical components of the human for pathological purposes. That is the basic definition. So it's the systematic study of the chemical process. So one, we study the chemical process associated with health, and disease, and then two, we measure the constituents of the body. So we can say body fluids or tissue, to facilitate diagnosis of disease. So this is the basic definition of chemical pathology. So first of all, we study the chemical processes associated with health first and then diseases. So these are two different things, health and diseases. So all the chemical processes that goes on in the body, we study them, and then we study the chemical processes that goes on in bodies that are diseased. Then after making our studies, we measure constituents to diagnose these diseases or these chemical processes that has been studied. So that is basically what chemical pathology is about. So we will start by talking about clinical enzymes. So under clinical enzymes, we will talk about functional plasma enzymes and then non-functional plasma enzymes. So we'll talk about series of enzymes that are used clinically for diagnosis, and then after that we'll talk about plasma proteins. Under plasma proteins, we can talk about albumin. We'll talk about albumin and then its clinical relevance. Then we'll talk about the alpha and beta proteins, then the immunoglobulins or gamma proteins. Then we'll talk about acute phase proteins. Then we'll talk about negative acute phase proteins. We'll talk about acute phase proteins, we'll talk about negative acute phase proteins. Then for urine and CSF proteins, we'll talk about the Bence-Jones proteins that is used to diagnose multiple myeloma. Then we will talk about certain chemical procedure that was used to determine urine proteins, like the Albutex method, etc. And after that, we will talk about acid-base balance. So under acid-base balance, we'll talk about acid-base regulation in the body. And under that, we'll talk about metabolic acidosis and alkalosis. We'll talk about metabolic acidosis and alkalosis We'll go further to talk about respiratory acidosis and alkalosis. Then we'll talk about compensatory mechanisms for each disorder. So under this one, we'll talk about a test we call arterial blood gas. Arterial blood gas. And that is what we use to determine this metabolic acidosis and respiratory alkalosis. Then after that, we'll come and talk about endocrinology. In fact, endocrinology is one of the broadest topics in clinical chemistry. So this one, we'll talk about the chemical processes associated with endocrinology. We'll talk about the synthesis of those endocrine glands. We'll distinguish between endocrine glands and exocrine glands. Then we'll talk about the processes that lead to the synthesis of certain endocrine glands. So this is purely, we'll go much deeper into the physiological aspects. Then we also dive into the pathological aspects as well in diagnosing diseases such as amenorrhea, and all those endocrinology diseases. Yeah. Then we'll talk about carbohydrates. So this one, the carbohydrate is more or less about glucose. So this is where we can talk about random blood sugar, fasting blood sugar, glycated hemoglobin, We'll talk about glycated hemoglobin. Then we'll talk about glycated albumin. We'll talk about glycated albumin as well. Then we'll talk about insulin. We'll talk much about insulin, and then a whole lot of chemical processes like glycolysis, glycogenolysis, lipolysis, etc. Then after that, we'll come and talk about liver and its disorder. So liver, we'll first talk about the physiology of the liver. Then we'll talk about bilirubin synthesis. Then we'll talk about liver function test. So here we'll dive much deeper into the liver function test. We'll talk about all the enzymes that contribute to liver function tests: ALT, AST, GGT, ALP. Then we will distinguish between, among these, we will distinguish the synthesis ability or the synthetic ability. Then we'll talk about synthetic ability. Then we'll talk about the damaging property, that is the enzymes, the production of the enzymes. Then we talk about the metabolic ability. That is where the bilirubin will come to play. Then we'll talk about kidney and body fluid regulation. So here we'll talk about the body fluid compartment. Then we'll talk about hyperkalemia, hypokalemia, and then we'll talk a little about the nephron. So a little bit of nephrology or kidney physiology here. Then we'll talk about the diseases that affect the kidney. So after that, we will talk about lipid metabolism as well, how all these lipids are synthesized: the triglyceride, the very low density lipoprotein, the low density lipoprotein, the chylomicrons. We'll go deeper into how they are synthesized and how they are regulated. Then we'll also come and talk about ion metabolisms. Then we'll talk about vitamins as well. Then here we'll talk about important chemistry markers and their clinical significance. So here we'll group all the tests. So we'll talk about lipid profile test, we'll talk about kidney function test, we'll talk about all the sugar tests like glycated hemoglobin, glycated albumin, um, random blood sugar, fasting blood sugar, oral glucose tolerance test. Then we'll go forward and talk about arterial blood gases. We'll talk about the cardiac markers or the cardiac function test, thyroid function test. Then we'll talk about the fertility test. Then we'll talk about tumor markers. So here, for instance, it's entirely clinical. So we'll list all the tests. We'll state their reference ranges and then their clinical significance as well. And then under clinical chemistry and more concepts, this one to talk about the calculations involved in clinical chemistry. So how to convert from one unit to the other, maybe, and then the reference ranges, what they mean, maybe from a milligram per deciliter to millimole per liter, how to convert from that to that, and vice versa. Okay. So here to talk a little bit about more concepts for us to get the understanding, grasp the understanding well. And then another quality control that will be our final topic. For the quality control, we'll talk about quality control itself, we'll talk about preparing controls, we'll talk about calibration of instruments, we'll talk about Levy-Jennes chart, and then we will list certain chemistry analyzers and their importance or what they do. Then we will take us all through how these chemistry analyzers work and their principle behind them, spectrophotometry, etc. So that will be it for chemical pathology in general. So chemical pathology is one interesting topic or interesting field to talk about. Alright guys, so see you in our next video. In our next video on the chemical pathology, we'll talk about clinical enzymes and we'll go much deeper into it. Alright, thank you for joining the introductory session. Bye.